All right. Hey, everybody, and welcome to our 1 o'clock panel. I'm Adrienne Lentz-Smith. I am an associate professor of history and AFAM at Duke University, and I'm on the editorial board for Meridians. I have the pleasure of hosting, but not really taking part in the conversation, um, with Kimala Price and Kristal Brent Zook. Um, Kimala is an associate professor and director of, or graduate advisor in women's studies at San Diego State University. Kristal Brent Zook is a journalist who has published in any magazine that you have read, from Essence to the New York Times Magazine to The Nation. And she is a professor of journalism at Hofstra. With that, I am just going to jump in and get y'all talking. And what I thought that I would do as our opening question is to ask you both to reflect a bit on what you were working on and or working through when you first published your pieces in Meridians, and then to think a little bit on how your article sort of shaped your trajectory. I think to do that, I'll sort of start with you individually, and I'll start with Kristal. And your piece tackles this question directly, right? You say, I went to Mississippi because my heart said go, and I trusted it to tell me why. So my question for you is, did your heart tell you why, and what did it tell you?
It did. um, the context is I was working on a book project, and I had a fairly intimidating contract to write a book on Black feminism. And the contract was an exploration of Black feminism, and my plan was to go across the country and see and talk to women and see what I could come up with and see what stories they told me. And I found Sarah White was, as I say in the book, the most important out of all these amazing women that I talked to. She was the most important to me personally. She was the closest to my heart. She changed me in ways that are even today hard to express. And I just learned so much by going to the South and spending time with her. So I was working through this book, and I'll talk later about the role that Meridians played and why it was so important to me. But I was struggling to get the story, to figure out what the book was going to be and what the stories were going to be.
And so Sarah White came to you.
She came along and she, of course, had no interest in the word feminism at all whatsoever. And so in some sense, she was part of my decision and part of the process of parting ways with my publisher, because they didn't like what I was doing, and I didn't like the mandate that I had to sort of force feminism on the women that I was talking to. And I ended up wanting to tell their stories the way that they told them to me, rather than imposing a structure on them.
And we should say, I mean, I'm assuming that everybody has read the 20th anniversary reader from cover to cover, but we should say that these are about Black women organizers in Indianola,
Right.
Mississippi. And so...
Right. Sarah White, yeah, she worked at a catfish plant called Delta Pride in Indianola. It was 90% Black women workers. It was a farming collective owned by 178 white men, probably on the same land that belonged to their slave-owning families generations prior. So that was the environment that I was walking into. And Sarah White organized a labor movement and a union. She brought the UFCW to Delta Pride and ended up organizing the largest strike ever to take place in the history of Mississippi in 1990. The largest strike of Black workers ever to take place in that state in 1990.
Thank you. So, Kim, I'll ask you the same question. How did you not how did you come to this project, but kind of what were you working through with this project? And I'll ask you for the sake of our audience to walk us through reproductive justice as a frame, right? Which is what you were writing about and do work on. And kind of what it draws together, what it pushes back on, and inspired by Kristal's comment, like what, if you were speaking through the language of your subjects, would you be talking about Black feminism? I can't hear you. Ooh, I still can't hear
Muted.
you. Oh, there you are.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, yeah, my mic somehow got muted. When I was working on this article, actually, I was sort of in the first few years of my appointment as an assistant professor here at San Diego State. And the article, to me, it sort of serves as a shift in the work that I was doing or ended up doing. And sort of to kind of explain that, I kind of have to go back a few years. In terms of like my original research, in terms of my dissertation, I was focusing a lot more on politics and policy, reproductive policy, and looking at how policy stories influence the kinds of policies that we get in terms of reproductive policy. Particularly in terms, specifically looking at emergency contraception and medication or medical abortion. But then sort of between my years as a graduate student and my appointment here at San Diego State, I did a 3-year postdoc in Cambridge, Massachusetts at a research center. And that postdoc was specifically for social scientists who do research on abortion and reproductive health. And it was during that time that Sister Song was sort of starting to rev up. And so a lot of the research that I was doing, in terms of my dissertation, also looked at race and class and so forth, and looking at how women of color figured into these policy discussions. But then, there was this excitement that there's this organization called Sister Song that was dedicated to women of color and reproductive health, and they had this new terminology, concept called reproductive justice. And so I was really excited about that. And in 2003, they had their very first conference in Atlanta at Spelman, and I was there. I went to the very first conference and really, started to learn about what the concept is. But then also thinking about that's kind of when I started to see the shift in sort of moving from just looking at policy and politics and really looking at terms of social movements and how women of color have really been significant players in the fight for reproductive freedom here in the United States. In terms of, it's a history that needs to be told. And in particular at the time when I was doing this, it had to be told because frankly, a lot of people were still thinking when we're talking about reproductive rights or reproductive freedom, they're only thinking about it in terms of gender and really only about white women and abortion. They're not really figuring into the ugly history that we've seen here in the United States when it comes to reproductive health in terms of coercive sterilization, in terms of slavery and how reproduction was treated during that time, in terms of Native American and indigenous women in the United States, when it came to their children were taken from their homes and put into boarding schools. And so expanding how we think about what reproduction is and sexuality and so forth. And so that's kind of how this article came into being. And I started doing a series of talks at universities like Georgetown Law School, the Harvard School of Public Health, and I did a couple of conferences kind of shaping this article. And originally, it was supposed to be part of an anthology, an edited volume on reproductive health, but the plans for that fell through. So I needed to find a place for it. And I could talk a little bit more about. For me, it's hard to find. It's always a challenge because my work is so intersectional. I mean, it touches on I'm a political scientist by training. But I also touch on women, women in gender studies, ethnic studies, sociology, public health. So it's always a challenge to find spaces for me and thinking about what's the right audience for a particular piece. And Meridians, I landed on Meridians. It was the very first journal that I submitted it to, and then it got accepted. But it served well over the years. It looks like it was the right place, considering sort of how this article has taken off in the last decade or so. And so that answer your question about what reproductive justice is, it's sort of it's a different framework. It's different from what we normally think of like reproductive rights in terms of individual choice and so forth. Um, Women of color, have always been involved in sort of these movements, but have pushed back this notion of choice, and that we should only be looking at reproduction through a gender lens. That we also have to look at not only gender, but also in terms of how race, class, sexuality, ability, and all those other things, all these other markers of our identities, how it shapes our abilities to form families, to have children, to decide when we want to have children and not to have children, to parent those children. And so reproductive justice was sort of pushing it back against this notion of choice. And how can we talk about choice when you might be struggling financially, or you might not have access to healthcare in general, and so on. And so really thinking about reproduction in a more intersectional way, and thinking about how it connects to other social issues. And that it's not just about the right not to have children, but the right to have children and to raise those children in safe and sustainable communities, and also your right to sort of personal autonomy. So that's kind of what reproductive justice is. And what's exciting about what's going on with reproductive justice now is that we're seeing more and more activists and scholars really expanding the definition of reproductive justice, but also looking specifically at how different social movements connect with reproductive justice, like, for example, environmental studies, environmental justice, economic justice, immigration, the Black Lives Matter movement. And I have been more recently looking at how it connects to the LGBTQ plus movement. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's in some ways the argument, or one of the arguments, is how can you even talk about choice in a life like surrounded by certain kinds of constraints or structures that kind of make it hard or impossible to you're not a free actor moving through an unfettered world. So let's make a
Right.
world of possibility, right? And justice, rather than pretend like
Right.
this
And it's
one
not,
thing
yeah,
is
and it's
the
not
thing.
just about the individual, it's about communities, because we're
Yeah.
seeing entire communities being targeted, whether it's like the coercive sterilizations that we've seen, like with Latinx women in California and Puerto Rico, Black women in the South, Native American women through Indian health services, way of thinking.
One of the things that's striking in kind of both of your articles and both of your answers, well, one in your answers is this way that it's really engaging with the people that you were writing about that changed what you were writing about and how you were thinking about it, which is how good scholarship works, right? Like you're not going in to write a legal brief. You're going in to learn and learn from your subjects. And also the importance of social movements in refining our sense of community and possibility. And, as you were talking about reproductive justice, I was thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer, who I thought about all the way through your article, Kristal. And in thinking about her, also thought a lot in your article about the kind of SNCC vision and model for social organizing and transformation, which is about not like teaching people how to be, but empowering them to see their own possibility and their capacity for being like sort of achieving or creating the world that they want and need. And that came through so much. You said Sarah White was close to your heart, and I too, like you can tell, like I loved her by the time I finished your article. And will you talk a little bit about her and the way that she carries some of your ideas out of this piece, right? What she makes you think about, what she makes the reader think about. Um, what she flags for us about these women's struggles more broadly speaking?
Yeah, sure. I think when we talk about intersectionality, she was just such a moving example of that in motion. Like I say in the piece, she had to be strong, and she learned how to stand up for herself and for her rights and for the rights of the women around her, at the same time that she didn't learn how to stand up in her personal life. She alluded to having been in an abusive relationship with a man, and how she never quite recovered from that, never recovered her self-esteem. Her sister came to visit her from Memphis, I think, and was shot dead by the sister's boyfriend in Sarah's living room. She was the child of a mother who had 11 children, talking about reproductive justice, reproductive freedom. Her father abandoned her mother after a car accident where he was driving and left the mother in a coma. And so there were so many points of intersection in talking about her struggle for justice and for freedom, that went beyond the catfish plant, right? And that overlapped in so many ways. And I talk about her diet and how I get on her nerves talking about her diet, because towards the end there, she was really struggling in terms of her health, and what wasn't listening to what her doctors were telling her about her health. And so it all tied in together in terms of self-love and her own development. As she became someone who spoke for the union and even traveled for the union and gave talks, I had to explain to her what an honorarium was and why wasn't she getting one, right? And even then she had trouble with this concept of just sort of standing up for herself personally when it didn't involve fighting for other women. So I think I've veered off of your question, but your question was, what was it again?
Like, what does she reveal? Like, if we're going to talk about, like, not using the language of Black feminism, but thinking about Black women's struggles and and create Black women's attempts to create a world that is livable for everyone, right? Like, how does she help us think through where labor and women's movements and other critiques, like other visions of justice and possibility, come together? Or are there other women you think who you encountered in that period who help you do that as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, how can you not work at a place that's 90% Black female workers, right, and owned by 178 white men, and sexual harassment is constant on the floor of the plant? How can you not experience, gender dynamics and discrimination and abuse? It's impossible. And yet she didn't frame that in terms of feminist theory or in terms of, what we generally talk about when we talk about feminism. And so that for me was the struggle. And I decided to simply tell her story as is, and not force this on it, and, let the reader decide what it all meant. But I think one of the most moving parts of the story was the bathrooms, which is such a gendered, right? Such a gendered struggle. And the fact that she told me when she said the strike was really about the bathrooms, when it all boils down to, where they had no right to use, they had to ask permission, first of all, to use the bathrooms outside of breaks. And then they were given bathroom privileges, so-called privileges, for 5 minutes a week. Were followed with a timer. Supervisor would follow them into the stall. They had stall doors removed to prevent dawdling. So no privacy, even if you were pregnant, 5 minutes per week. And so when they threatened to take away those rights again, that's when the women voted overwhelmingly to walk out. And so I just think the word intersectionality keeps coming up in my mind, and in our conversations here today, that her story it just epitomizes on every level, every kind of struggle that you could think of: economic, spiritual, health, mental, sexual, racial. So that's how she impacted me. And I will say we had a couple of things in common, but then we diverged. And so that's where I feel like I grew from her and I learned from her. Her mother cleaned houses of white folks. My grandmother cleaned houses of white folks. Her father abandoned the family. My father abandoned the family. My white father abandoned my black mother. But then we diverged. I went to college. He went to college, but it didn't help.
Right.
It didn't help. And she never quite made it past, where she wanted to be. And so she opened up the conversation for me in ways that I hadn't seen before.
It's like you keep using the language of stories, right? Her story, the story you were telling, the stories they told you, how those came together to make the story that ends up in Meridians. And I know, Kim, that in your piece, storytelling and thinking about storytelling and what it does is part of your analytic. And so, in Kristal's, I see the past, like the past is so present in the story that she has to tell, that in some ways you don't have to have an outside, I mean, you do have to have, but you can have a light hand as an outside narrator, like pulling the past out. In yours, I mean, and you can tell me if this is wrong, but is it the case that Sister Song at least is mobilizing narratives of the past in a particular, in service to the present? Will you talk a little bit about how they're doing that?
Yeah, and narrative is something as an analytic that I was using ever since graduate school. I actually fell in love with the notion of doing narrative analysis, particularly coming from a discipline, political science, which the mainstream tends to be very sort of quantitative and about statistics and whatnot. And I wanted to move away from that because when you're talking about reproduction and reproductive health and whatnot, a lot of it's about the rhetoric and about the stories that we tell, right? And so I was already coming from a point of using narrative as an analytical tool and all the work that I was doing, which was great with Sister Song because as an activist tool, as a form of consciousness raising, they are telling stories. I mean, and sort of I come from the viewpoint that as human beings, that's how we make sense of the world, right? We make sense of the world by telling stories. When we meet each other, the first thing we do is we get to know each other through telling stories of like who we are, where we came from, about our families, and so on, right? And so it does make sense that even when you're trying to draw people into a movement and getting them motivated and whatnot, and give them a sense of purpose and a sense of mission, you tell stories, or to even get them to understand that their experiences are not isolated, that they are connected, that there are other people who have similar experiences. So you do that through storytelling. And so part of what Sister Song does a lot through its meetings, through its conferences, through the work that it does, the workshops, is by telling stories about the past, about us reclaiming those stories and putting us back into that history of thinking about the legacy of slavery, thinking about the legacy of coercive sterilizations, thinking about all these other things that normally hasn't been told in the sort of the mainstream sort of telling about reproduction. It tends to be focused more about abortion and access to abortion, and particularly white women's access to abortion. And so storytelling was a way of putting us back into that history and putting us into that history, but also saying, having women tell their stories and other folks telling their stories so they can understand how this framework is reflective of their experiences, and sort of acknowledging and affirming those experiences. And I've seen this happen at the local level. When I was doing that postdoc in Cambridge, actually start a sort of women of color reproductive justice network in the Boston area. And so we were, I was going to those meetings, and particularly the first few meetings, what we were doing were basically telling stories about our experiences, whether it's experiences about giving birth or about our experiences with the OBGYN, about raising children, and so on, as a way for us to understand how, at an individual, at our sort of personal level, how reproductive justice worked. And I think for some folks, they didn't even really think about, if they had some really weird experiences with the OBGYN, they didn't think of that as a reproductive justice issue, that it was some sort of personal issue, or that was that particular doctor or whatever, not seeing that it is kind of part of a pattern of how women of color have been treated by the medical and health professions. And so it was sort of a happy marriage between sort of what I was already thinking about doing and what Sister Song was already doing. And so it was sort of, the right fit to kind of think about it that way.
So one of the things that we want to do is also get a sense of kind of how your thinking has changed, where you're at now, since you published your piece in Meridians. So I have that question for you, both about your own work, your own thinking, like where you are and what you're thinking about, but also where you think the struggle for reproductive justice is. You talked on that a little bit in your opening remarks, the convergence of things, but I wondered if you had more to say.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-oh, I can't hear Kim. Can you hear Kim?
No, I think she's frozen.
Kim,
There we go. There we go.
Uh-oh.
All right, now we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good. Yeah. Sometimes, for some reason, my internet has decided to rebel against me. It was working fine, and then so today it just decided to go haywire. But anyway, so I was saying, the term itself has taken on a life of its own over the last decade, and we're seeing more and more activists, even those within sort of the mainstream reproductive rights movement, using it. But there's a point of contention, because in terms of, I think people are using it as a term that's the new term to use, but not really fully understanding the concept itself, and that is not just a synonym for just reproductive rights or choice. And I know a few years ago, there was some tensions between sort of the mainstream movement and the women of color and the reproductive justice movement, because there was an article that was written like in the New York Times or what have you. I think it was the New York Times. And they were talking about, there's this new framework called reproductive justice. And they're, saying it's intersectional, whatever. But the article was featuring the same old mainstream organizations like Planned Parenthood, NARAL, and they were sort of crediting those organizations for the term. And of course, as you can see, I would guess, it caused a lot of furor within the reproductive justice movement, this pushback in terms of who can use the term, what the term means. And so you sort of have that. So it's evolving in terms of what it means, but also there are those of us who are also trying to push the boundaries and push the definitions of reproductive justice and making it more expansive in terms of, like, for example, you have organizers talking about birthing justice and connecting reproductive justice, childbirth and pregnancy, and thinking about sort of the right to give birth in the manner that you would like to have it, whether you want to use a midwife versus a physician in the hospital versus at home and so forth. I've been working on in terms of looking at the LGBTQ movement and how activists within both the RJ movement and the LGBTQ movement have been expanding reproductive justice to include sexual justice, meaning that it's not just only about sort of having children, but also the right to engage in adult consensual sexual activity without sort of any interference, being able to form the family that you want through marriage and have that supported, and recognized by the state in terms of your freedom to gender identity and expression, to sexual identity and orientation and so forth, sort of expanding it in terms of that. But also there are activists and scholars who are looking at the connections between the environment and reproductive justice and the impact of the environments that a lot of people of color, low-income people are living in that tend not to be the best in terms of environment. And so if you're talking about being able to raise your kids in safe and sustainable communities, they should also be in communities that are environmentally sound and so forth. But, people are talking about, disability studies, connections to RJ, economic justice, as I said, Black Lives Matter. We've been seeing people making those connections saying, we're talking about police violence and so forth. Again, if we're talking about being able to raise our children, our families in safe and sustainable communities, police violence figures into that as well. So it's really exciting. I think it's very exciting that, there are these new articles and books that are coming out that really are looking at all of these different connections and thinking about the potentials of political coalitions between all of these social movements and how that could be very powerful in terms of creating sort of the social change and social transformation that we're looking for, that we're all sort of, even though we're doing our own little things, but we're coming together and making those connections and to move forward.
Cool. And then Kristal, sort of a similar question. So have you kept in touch with the folks in your article? Sort of where is Indianola now? And then where are you now? Where's your brain? What are you thinking about? And do you see a link to previous work, or is there a departure? Because sometimes, you just move. You move far away from where you were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I did keep in touch with Sarah for many years. Every couple of years we would talk, and then last several years I haven't talked to her, and her number was disconnected. I left a couple of messages at the union office. I could find her, if I put some effort, but she wasn't there. So I don't really know how that office is doing right now. But I do, hold that time of my life this was 1995. I hold it still as a transformational moment in my own development, not only personally, but in my career. Because as I said, it was, the story was rejected by my publisher as not fitting into what they wanted to do, which I think was more of a conversation about white feminism and Black feminism together. And that was my take at the time. So I put it in a drawer, and I was really very disheartened and very discouraged. It was a big contract, and I had lost it. And Meridians came along at some point and gave me the confidence again that, I was on the right track telling the story, and it was of value, and it was meaningful. And I can't overstate how important that was at that moment to know. I still wasn't ready to take it out of the drawer as a book, but telling Sarah's story, which was the centerpiece of the book, gave me that. It stayed with me. And then some years later, I took it out of the drawer, and it became Black Women's Lives, Stories of Pain and Power, and her story is in here. It went to a different publisher, a smaller publisher, Nation Books, and they said, we love it as is. And it was the story of 11 women, 12 women, forget now, across the country from all walks of life. So changed me, completely changed me. And it moved me from, I was doing a lot of cultural reporting about film and TV and race and gender, but it moved me into social justice stories. By that time I was coming to New York, working with Essence magazine, and I was really writing more about social justice issues for the first time directly, hard news, AIDS, prison reform, prisoners' rights, environmental justice. I, wrote about lead in Alabama, lead poisoning in Alabama, just all kinds of stories that put me on a different trajectory beyond, culture, as a part of culture. So where am I now? I am looking forward to Black Women's Lives possibly being reissued as a reprint 15 years later. I think I may have a publisher for that at this point, so I'm really excited about that. And just continuing to tell stories that I think are meaningful and important, and hopefully being the vessel to do that they can come through me and I can help bring them into the world.
So we have just a couple more minutes before we're supposed to turn to question and answers. That requires y'all in the audience to ask us some questions. So put them in that ask a question box, right, I think it's just a little instruction at the bottom right side of your screen, but use that to put your questions in. And for the final question, and you touched on this, Kristal, a little bit, I was going to ask how Meridians has figured in your work, thinking, teaching, what have you, over the years. I mean, it sounds like for you, it gave this work a home, right? And offered a reminder that it matters, even if it wasn't the conversation that someone had set out for you ahead of time.
Yeah, it was validation at a time when I really needed it more than probably I realized. And I can remember reading the back of the journal at that time, 2000, reading the definition of meridians. I can remember sitting there and reading it over and over and over again and just letting it fill me. All of those definitions of what does meridian mean, right? Meridians. And I remember that very clearly, that it had that kind of impact on me.
That's nice. Kim?
Well, I have sort of incorporated Meridians as sort of one of the journals I've had like my graduate students sort of consult when we're thinking about sort of the state of the field in terms of women and gender studies. That's something I've done. But I have to say, sort of my love affair with Meridians began before I published my article in 2010. Because about a couple of years before then, Meridians actually did a whole special issue on hip hop and feminism, and actually still have that right here. And actually, this is a copy that was passed along to me by my colleague of mine, because also during sort of my earlier years of my career, I was looking at hip hop and feminism. I had been involved with the National Hip Hop Political Convention in New Jersey. I've written a piece about hip hop and feminism for an anthology called Homegirls Make Some Noise. And because, it was a time where we were thinking about, particularly those of us who are young women of color, young Black women, and thinking about this culture that we all grew up in, hip hop, and thinking about how to think about it critically in terms of gender, race, and sexuality, and so forth. And so the fact that Meridians, an academic journal that dedicated an entire issue to this, was something I thought was fantastic, because I can't imagine any other sort of academic journal doing something like that, right?
Right. I am going to turn to our first question for our panel. This one says, Kristal, as a journalist, your work seems to be part of a long feminist tradition established by Ida B. Wells of truth-telling from communities that are typically either silenced or disregarded. Could you reflect a bit on your work as a journalist and, moreover, as a professor of journalism? And then I'm going to tack onto there my own question, which is that I've seen a lot of critiques by journalists of color, particularly women journalists of color, about lazy narrative shortcuts that perpetuate or reproduce racist or sexist frames. And so I wondered if you had thoughts about that as well.
That's a great question, and thank you. It also reminds me, I did want to tell this story about that I had pitched Sarah White's story to Essence early on, and I was told that because she led the strike in 1990, it's no longer newsworthy. And for what it's worth, we do have to sort of be in the moment and follow the news, but I just wouldn't accept that. I said, she led the largest strike of Black workers ever in the history of the state of Mississippi. And so, end of the story is eventually it did become, in essence, feature profile. If you, Megan, if you want to show the slide. And the second one as well. And so, and that's it. We can just leave it at that. But if you want to take the slides down, it was just important. Yeah, and there's Sarah again. Because I can't express to you how meaningful that was for Sarah, because for her it was its own kind of validation to appear in Essence magazine and to just have her work be seen on a national scale in a way that it never had before. Essence is still the largest publication in the world for Black women, and so in terms of journalism, I just think that there are these restrictions and there are battles that we have to fight. But you can combine social justice storytelling with journalism in important ways, I think. And that's what I try to teach my students. You can sort of make that marriage work. And at Essence during that time, they called me, I was the go-to for tough issues, go to Alabama, go to small towns and wherever to report about, whatever issues, or go to this prison or go to that. And I did that work happily because I believe that the issues deserved to be on a national stage and to be heard, by broader publics. That's work that we can't do as academics all the time. We just can't keep the conversation so insular, that the wider publics don't hear them or see them. And so that's my passion. I taught African American studies and women's studies and cultural studies, but when I became a journalism professor, I found my home. This is what I do. This is what I've done for a long time. So this is really where I feel, my own personal calling.
Thanks. And then our final question in our final 6 minutes goes to Kim. It says, Professor Price writes about gathering Native data. What is Native data? Can narrative be quantified and still retain its value as standalone testimony? And the question is for Professor Price, they say, but they would also like to hear Dr. Zook's contribution to hear her answer as well. So it's directed at you, Kim, but they want both of y'all to jump in.
What is narrative data? That's what I understand what the question is, right?
And can narrative be quantified and still retain its value as standalone testimony?
Yeah, I actually been asked to review articles where people were using narrative analysis. It was a straight up quantitative where they were actually trying to turn the text into numbers and then crunch that. I'm not necessarily going in that direction, but I think you could do things like, for me, when I'm doing narrative analysis, part of it is sort of doing a close reading, kind of like you would do sort of literary, right? But also I'm a social scientist by training. So there's also this kind of part of me that wants to be still a little bit more systematic. And so I still do code in terms of the themes that I see kind of emerging from the stories. And when I say stories, I sort of use it in a way that we kind of think of stories as these self-contained sort of narratives where you sort of have a beginning and an ending. I don't know if you want to say a plot, but there is something that they're trying to convey to you, some sort of idea, some sort of experience. And so kind of sort of, bunching them into those kind of containers. And it's not as easy as you think, because sometimes people will start into a story and then they go into something else and they come back. So, I'm not going to say that it's easy to have a finite, way of thinking about stories. But that's kind of how I kind of like to think about them in terms of there's a specific topic, a theme, and something that you're trying to convey. But also at the same time, trying to see, because for me, I'm like, really embed a lot of assumptions and biases and whatnot in our stories. And also it's not only about the person who's telling the stories, but how the audience interprets it, right? And kind of we live in a shared, culture or shared whatever. And there are these, these values, these beliefs that float around that somehow always seeps into our stories, right? And so for me, I'm always trying to sort of uncover what is the assumption in these stories? What is the theme driving these stories? And I sort of approach it not from me saying, I'm expecting these themes and I'm going to try to enforce my way of thinking about it, but thinking about it more organically and reading the stories themselves and kind of let the themes sort of emerge out of the stories instead of me so trying to impose my, viewpoint or my particular, or what I believe are the themes that should be coming out of that, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And sort of asking, what work do these stories do? Kind of
Right.
individually and accrued.
Right.
I think storytelling is everything, and from my perspective, it's I don't do academic research anymore. I'm not a social scientist. Narrative for me, in terms of journalism, is everything, because that's how you get inside of people's. That's how you change hearts and minds.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you convey a different worldview, maybe that they hadn't experienced before. And so, when I learned that the women were hanging the chickens in the chicken plant, ripping the breast off at 32 birds a minute,
That's crazy.
and said,
Wow.
carpal tunnel was rampant and they couldn't get medical care, that's going to change anybody's life. If you're sitting down face to face with somebody in a blue hairnet with chicken blood all over them, and they don't even have time to wash their face while they have lunch, that's going to change your worldview. So that's how I embrace narrative, and it's absolutely everything to what I'm trying to do.
That's wonderful. Yeah. I have a colleague here at Duke who says whoever tells the best story wins. And he means that in terms of his own arrogance about his writing, but he also means it in terms of contestations over power and meaning and what gets traction and who gets paid attention to and why, right? And I mean, I think that
Right, or who gets to define who gets to define the discussion, like the parameters of the discussion, particularly when we're talking about politics and policy. I mean, we've seen on the right, the conservative right, they have been very successful over the last few decades, right, in terms of shaping the narrative, in terms of how we think about abortion and all the other reproductive and sexual health issues, through their particular way of telling stories, right?
And about the interrelatedness of those issues, right?
Yeah.
And then about the evil of talking about things like intersectionality or thinking critically, right? That this is all, in some ways, what seems like silly fights over language are actually very, very consequential battles over meaning. So we actually just started a conversation that could be a whole nother panel, but we're at the end of our panel, sadly, which means that I will say that I hope we have an opportunity to gather together at some point and talk. And that in that I include our audience. Thank you for joining us. Thank y'all so much for doing this. And thank you for your work, writerly and otherwise.
Thank you.
Thank you.